So welcome. I am Dr. Anna Smith, and I'm excited to welcome you to our third session in the 2025 Creatively Critical Tech Research Design Practice Speaker Series. So I have some introductory remarks, and if you've joined us for other talks, you know what these are going to be. So while I make them, please make use of the chat option on the side. The button is down below, and you can click on that. Make sure it's toggled to everyone, and introduce yourself and who you are, where you're coming from, what brings you to tonight. We would appreciate that. We want to keep the chat open for the most dialogic experience possible, but please respect that, and let's keep our comments productive. So the Creatively Critical Tech series comes to us from the Education Now Lab at Illinois State University in the School of Teaching and Learning. And the Education Now Lab is a community-engaged research practice lab that uses immersive and emerging technologies to inquire and produce a range of critical, interdisciplinary, public, new media scholarship with and alongside community members as we labor toward more just educational futures. And I will share in the chat in just a minute some links of where you can find that and follow us. We also have recordings of previous sessions that you can check out too. And so this series is sponsored through an Advancing Research in Creative Technologies Tier 2 grant from the ISU Office of Research. And we want to thank them for their support. And in that, we want to recognize the continuous ways that our work at Illinois State University is supported by histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of this institution across more than 160 years. And so specifically the harm inflicted in our institution by being built on the land and waterways of multiple Indigenous nations who were forcibly removed, including the Illini, the Peoria, the Miami, and others. And I've said this in our previous sessions and in even the last series 2 years ago, we are continuing to see sustained struggles and real atrocities happening about peoples and lands in current events. And I hope we can dedicate our work and our energies that come from our conversations toward whatever is best for action toward more communal well-being and flourishing. I'm very excited to introduce our speaker tonight for multiple reasons, but I don't think she knows this, but she was at the very beginning of the launch of the Education Now Lab. In 2020, I was teaching a course that's called Critical Perspectives in Technology and Education for the first time. We wanted to do more in that moment in 2020 than just talk in our doctoral course about tech. We wanted to take up a real critical perspective, and that means praxis in the world. And I think it was Twitter, rest in peace, that I saw Audrey Waters' offer to join people in their new Zoom schools, right, to come be a guest speaker. And she came and she talked to our class about how we imagine the future and how we've always been the whole imagination that we have about the future and how we act in the now and with those visions in mind in the future. And her offer to come to be a speaker launched our idea about the speaker series. We've now have a theory method speaker symposium series that's run for 2 years. We've had the Creatively Critical Tech series, and our approach in the Education Now Lab of being a place where we can come together across different disciplines, across community members in a university to really support each other in the current needs that they have really came out of that semester and the work that Audrey shared with us at that time. So Audrey Waters is an independent scholar whose work focuses on the history and politics of education technologies. Although she was 2 chapters into her comparative literature dissertation, she abandoned academia. I can see why I felt that way myself at moments. And she now is happy in a fulfilling job around a freelance writer, journalist, and she has written for multiple journals and across the web and print journals too. And she's best known for her work with Hack Education, which is where I came to know your work and started learning from it myself. So she's currently the author of Second Breath's newsletter, which I'll link to here in the chat in a minute. And she has given keynotes and presentations around the world and many books I love the titles of the first series. So The Monsters of Education Technology, The Revenge of the Monsters of Education Technology, The Curse of the Monsters of Education Technology, and more. And her most recent book, Teaching Machines with MIT Press, examines the prehistory of personalized learning. And she was the recipient of the Spencer Education Journalism Fellowship at Columbia University in 2017, 2018. And she currently lives in New York City with her husband, Ken, and her dog, Poppy. So I am very excited to have you back with the Now Education Now Lab that was so influenced by you. Oh, I think I need to unmute you. Sorry. I took off the option and now there we
Thank you.
go.
Thank you so much for having me to speak today. I actually decided not to do slides. So I'm just going to be um, talking at this sort of awful experience of talking at yourself on Zoom. Slides are sometimes better, I think, to hide behind. But I want to talk today about um, grief and AI, but not grief bots, which we maybe we could talk about. I'm going to talk for about 30, 40 minutes, and then I'm happy to answer any questions. All right. Grief. There is no good way to say this. These are the opening words of Chinese American writer Yiyan Li's latest book, Things in Nature Only Grow, about her life after the death by suicide of both of her sons. There is no good way to say this. My heart goes out to you if you too have had this sentence spoken to you. There is no good way to say this is a sentence always followed by very bad news. And it is, I recognize, maybe an unsurprising way to start a talk by yours truly, someone who's made a career out of describing education technology as very bad news. There is no good way to say this. It's also an admission on my part that what I want to talk about tonight are thoughts that are quite tentative, quite tender. My husband texted me earlier, "Is it going to be a good talk?" And I had to say, "Oh boy, I I really don't know." So bear with me. Um, but let me read the first few paragraphs from Lee's memoir, more than just that first sentence, because it is a radical book on death and endurance and acceptance. I want to honor her words. And I think that we often think of acceptance as the antithesis of radical, really. We think of it as complacence, as surrender. Here's how she starts her book. There is no good way to say this. When the police arrive, they inevitably preface the bad news with that sentence, as though their presence had not been ominous enough. The first time I heard the line, I knew already what was about to be conveyed. Nevertheless, I paid attention to how the news was delivered. The detective insisted that I take a seat first. I sat down at the dinner table, and he moved another chair to the right distance and sat down himself. No doubt he was following protocol, and yet the sentence, there is no good way to say this, struck me as both accurate and effective. It must be a sentence that, though nearly a cliche, is not often used in daily conversation. Its precision has stayed with me. The second time, having guessed the news about to be delivered, I did not give the sentence a moment's thought. I did not wait for the detective to ask me to sit down either. I indicated a chair where my husband should sit and took the other chair in the living room. My heart already beginning to feel that sensation for which there is no name. Call it aching, call it wrenching, call it shattering. They are all wrong words, useless in their familiarity. This time, the four policemen all stood. There is no good way to say this. There's no easy way to talk about this. There are acceptable words, I suppose, but they are never good, never remotely satisfying or even comforting. Not to say, not to hear. By this, I mean death, obviously. By this, I mean other traumas, other endings. By this, I mean, too, what might feel like or look like right now the end of education. an end not spoken about with the solemnity of those policemen, but with some real jubilation from many technologists and venture capitalists who gloat about disruption. And I want to start here. And by here, I mean the recognition that there is no good way, no easy way to talk about death, no good way to talk about grief, even though I'm trying very hard to do so, to talk about grief, mine, yours, your students, your teachers, and to tie it to artificial intelligence. Maybe it feels like a stretch. But I want to talk about grief and the end. I want to talk about the end of the world. I mean, I don't really. Um, but I want to talk about what it feels like to feel like the world is ending. And maybe it will be if we continue to build data centers, invest in this rapacious technology, and ignore climate change. Quite literally, the end of the world. And I want to talk about the destruction of the future, our own future, our children's future, about the end of democracy and the end of education. I want to talk about loss. I want to talk about loss that feels like an abandonment, maybe an abdication, an absence, erasure, trauma, death, mass death, literal and metaphorical. There is no good way to say this. I've read a lot of memoirs about dying and grieving. Joan Didion's The Year of Magical Thinking, of course, Geraldine Brooks' recent book, Memorial Days, C.S. Lewis's book, A Grief Observed, which is a phrase I borrowed to title this talk, Michelle Zauner's Crying at H Mart, Helen McDonald's H is for Hawk. I could go on and list many wonderful painful books. And yet, despite some of the greatest writers of our time having tried, there is no good way to say this. I know this. I know this intimately. But we still search for good words to say, for good words to read, words to comfort, words to find meaning, to make meaning, words to make this feel, to make sense, words so that we don't feel so utterly alone, at the abyss, abysmal, though, because those we love the most have left us, and the future that we thought we were going to share is gone too. There is no good way to say this, the police told Yi Yun Lee. And I don't think the coroner said those exact words to me, although he might have done, when in May 2020, I received a phone call that my own son had died. I don't remember the words, but I remember the feeling. Everything tilting and spinning and spiraling. The blood drains, the stomach drains, that your stomach sinks, and it is a cliche, but your world ends. All those are words, feelings of really an indescribable, unspeakable loss. May 2020 was, if you'll recall, the the early days, the early weeks of COVID, of the COVID lockdown. Isaiah, my son, was in Seattle, Washington. I was in Oakland, California. He died alone in his apartment of an opioid overdose. And a few weeks later, OpenAI released GPT-3. Our tools are cultural. They are not merely technological. And so while many people, I think, want to frame the emergence of generative AI as a scientific development, right? In this sort of long history of computing, of artificial intelligence, transformers, neural networks, tokens, what have you, we have to remember that what emerges is not just a matter of engineering, right? It's a matter of markets and politics and ideology and culture. And so I think it matters. I think it matters that GPT was released during COVID, during the COVID pandemic, and ChatGPT shortly after, when many of us were stuck at home, isolated, alone, interacting with one another almost entirely through screens. And I think it matters that all this talk about the potential of AI to do our jobs in particular comes after labor made some very important, albeit tentative, gains during this period, right? The whole framing of someone as an essential worker, right? A successful push for unionization in many sectors. The astonishment, if you'll recall, from parents about teaching. I remember people saying, oh, teachers should make hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. Demands during and then after the pandemic to continue to work from home, to continue to be able to attend school from home, to have more control over space and place and time. AI is a backlash because AI is anti-worker. I always feel the need to remind people that robots are not coming for your job, right? AI is not coming for your job, but management probably is. I think it matters too that AI, this latest AI push with generative AI's sort of penchant for bullshit, follows on the heels around the same time in 2020 of what we recognized were growing mis and disinformation campaigns online. This was precisely what people were realizing after Donald Trump's first election as president during his first term in office. And this is precisely what LLMs have been trained on, right? And I think it matters that the technology industry relies on deception and obfuscation and manipulation, and it markets these machines, these bullshit machines, right? As the leaders of this country have also openly embraced being liars, being cheats, being frauds, and have openly rejected knowledge and expertise. I think it matters that AI is utterly opaque in how it makes its decisions in its algorithmic predictions. And as such, I think is a convenient unaccountability machine. I think it matters that economic inequality has exploded in the last few decades, and that the promises we've made to students in particular, that if you get good grades, you'll get into a good school. If you go to a good school, you'll get a good job. They feel pretty empty. AI is a normal technology. This is what AI professors Arvind Narayan and Sayesh Kapoor have argued. But what have we come to see as normal, right? What if this is in fact abhorrent, abysmal? And Yian Li writes a lot in her book on learning to inhabit the abyss of grief. But what does it mean that as a society, we have normalized living in the abyss of grief, right? AI feels to me like a symptom of a broken world. AI is a symptom and it is also the disease. So generative AI emerged during the global pandemic, a global trauma, right? A global trauma of mass death. Some 1.2 million people, according to the figures, died of COVID, 7 million people worldwide. Figures that are probably grossly underestimate the number of people who died of the disease, and certainly doesn't include the number of people like my son who died during the period of other related, unrelated causes, suicide, murder, overdose, other deaths. Mass trauma. We've experienced mass trauma, all of us. All of us are affected by this. Mass trauma, mass death, and as such, mass grieving, right? But it was at the time, and I think still to this day, grief interrupted, grief buried, grief denied, grief contrary to how C.S. Lewis phrased his book, grief unobserved, grief hidden, right? We were not able to bury our dead. We were not able to hold funerals. We were not able to hold wakes. We were not able to observe the rituals of death. We were not able to gather. We were not able to take food to our neighbors. We were not able to break bread with our neighbors. We were not able to hold each other. we were not able to comfort each other in person. This, I think, perpetuates the trauma. And when we were told that the pandemic was over, and it hasn't really ended, I looked up, the World Health Organization says there were 150,000 cases of COVID just last month. We haven't dealt with that trauma as a society, individuals or as a society, many of us. We didn't deal with our grief. We were supposed to just bury our feelings. We were supposed to forget. It was back to school, back to work, back to normal, or some new normal now with AI, a technology that I don't think we want. We certainly didn't ask for. And now we're told we cannot refuse. Of course, that's not quite right. We can refuse. One more correction, I guess. There was, in fact, a massive demonstration of grief, an outpouring of grief in public during COVID. And that was the Black Lives Matter movement, protests that occurred in cities throughout the country, particularly after the murder of George Floyd. This grief was not private, was not hidden, and it was shared, it was collective. It was not just personal, expressed by those directly impacted by racism, by police violence. It was expressed and demanded by protesters and demanded from protesters and onlookers, right? Empathy. It demanded empathy. It demanded solidarity. This grief was expressive, and even as we're always told with protests, as with grief, that there is no good way to do it, right? This grief over Floyd's death, all the deaths, was not sufficient. It never felt sufficient. It wasn't simply a marker or a memorial of death. It was also an act of life, an act of repair. It was a demand. It was a demonstration of love and loss and fury, and it was a commitment to the future. Again, remember, technology is cultural, it is ideological, it's not just technology. And so it matters. It matters that generative AI has emerged with or alongside, you can pick your preposition, I think, with a politics that is openly hostile to Black Lives Matter, that opposes diversity, equity, and inclusion. It matters that Silicon Valley companies were among the first to backtrack from their DEI initiatives. We're happy to stand with Donald Trump on his inauguration day, are gleeful that he has proclaimed that AI should be purged of ideological biases, purged of woke. And generative AI is, I think, with or without Trump's executive orders, a backlash to labor, as I said, but also a backlash to diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's a reinscription of the words and images of a white supremacist, heteronormative, Western, English-speaking capitalist patriarchy. That's the corpus that large language models have been trained on, the canon, right, with all the copyright violations that has entailed, and the internet, right? Thousands and thousands and thousands, stereotypically here, of YouTube videos and YouTube comments and Reddit forums, and apologies to everyone here this evening, probably lots of very mediocre freshman essays on the theme of family in Romeo and Juliet, and that sort of thing. So in response to a radical outpouring of love and loss and grief, demand for racial justice expressed together, embodied on the streets, we've been presented, forced to use, I think in many cases, a technology that severs us from creative expression, severs us from dignity, severs us from truth, severs us from trusting one another. There's no choice, we're told, get over it, move on. So one of the problems with grief, as Yi-Yun Lee writes in her book, is that it's described as a series of stages that you move through, as though there's like a beginning and significantly an end. You'll eventually people will really tell you, get over it. This is Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's famous formulation. If you know it, grief is a series of emotional stages that move from denial to anger, then bargaining, then depression, and then finally acceptance. I think this has been revised somewhat since she first published her book on death and dying in 1969. But society still gives mourners, and not just as workers, but most definitely as workers, a very limited amount of time to deal with it before you're expected to move on. Um, of course, we like thinking of things in stages, right? We humans, we like to order things, we like to frame our world, we like to frame our understanding of time this way. I think that makes sense to us to have seasons and stages and hours and days. We ritualize these. Indeed, I think that's one of the reasons why the inability to have rituals to conduct sort of traditional practices associated with death and dying during COVID made it all so much more unbearable, and sort of our inability to understand and move forward. Without rites, without rituals, you can't really move on. You can't grow or shift or change. You're stuck. You're stuck in the past. You're stuck. So the anthropologist Victor Turner used this term liminality to describe one of the key phases of rites of passage, of rituals like this, rituals that mark transition, not just transition into the afterlife, although we could think of that as a rite of passage, but transition into adulthood, into marriage, into society. This is a liminal phase, he called it, was betwixt and between, a period where you are in the process of becoming something new, but you're not a new person yet, nor are you the person that you were any longer. Um, Liminality, he argued, was this sort of limbo. But in that limbo, something really radical happens, something really transformational happens in these rituals, something radical even in the most conservative and traditional practices. Liminality is a time, and to be fair, it can be a very, very brief moment, depending on the rite of passage, of solidarity, he argued, of equality and unity. Protests, for example, are liminal spaces. Um, and education, I'd argue, has some elements of this liminality. It's a rite of passage in a way. It's a ritual of becoming, right? You enter a child, a fresh man, and you leave an adult. And we've retained some parts of these rituals. We think about this space, its campus, as being separate, right? Rituals and rites of practice, these rites of passage are often in separate, secluded spaces. Campuses traditionally a secluded space, a separate space from society, the ivory tower cliche. We have the cap and gown, right? You move the tassel from one side to the other in this sort of ritual act of now you're a graduate. But there's more to it, right, than these practices. I think one of the important things about being in this liminal stage, being in limbo, is that you have to commit yourself to that transformation, right? You have to believe. You have to believe that it's going to work, right? Socially, culturally, politically, we have to believe it's worthwhile to send children to school, to send them to college. We have to believe that they're going to become, right? But I think much to the detriment of learning, let alone to the survival of educational institutions, I think education has lost some of that magic, right? We've seen for the last 100 years at least, education defined as something else, and increasingly as a product, not a process, right? It's certification, not transformation. And this idea of liminality has been shattered. And instead of ritual, society demands outcomes, it demands optimization, right? It demands a machinery instead of magic. And so I think by dismantling educational institutions, and AI is really just part of a longer history of this, we're also dismantling a place for this shared practice and purpose for a shared understanding. This is communitas, Victor Turner called it, a key part of this liminality, this idea of a special sacred community of practitioners together. And the technology industry, really capitalism, prefers individualization. It doesn't like solidarity. It prefers immediacy to process. It wants instant. It pays lip service to community, of course. Mark Zuckerberg, blah, 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 Facebook, connecting the world, blah, 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 whatever. But the mission is very different. The practice is very different than community. The tech industry's allegiance, I think, is to surveillance capitalism, to profit, to power, not to knowledge, not to community, not to people. I think what we're experiencing now with AI, with the defunding of education and public research, with deportations, with technology enhanced surveillance, is more trauma, more loss, more grief. And there is no silver lining here, as Ian Lee reminds us, as much as you got to look on the bright side is often given to those grieving, some sort of tepid consolation. Grief, just to reiterate, involves a loss of identity, right? It's a loss of the future, how we imagined things would be, who we imagined we'd become. And there's no good way to say this. Sometimes it gets worse. It doesn't get easier. It doesn't get better, not with the passage of time, not with the number of times you experience it. And yet, we try. There's no good way to say this, but we try. We try. That's because we're human. Um, and I can only say this, it's not good and it's not sufficient. It's not really a satisfying way to wrap up this talk, but here we go. Grief is an expression of love. We grieve because we love, and love does not end with death. I grieve for my son. I will grieve forever. I grieve for the future that we will not share. And when I talk to teachers and students alike these days, I hear so much grief as well. So much grief. Grief about what AI threatens to do to education, grief about what AI threatens to do to the future, grief about what AI threatens to do to work, what it's already done to the work of teaching and the work of learning, the work of research and reading and writing. I think there's so much grief and so much trauma compounded on one another. But remember, we grieve because we love. We grieve because we care. We grieve because we know the machines do not, and that the community we try to foster on a campus, in a classroom, in our writing, in our work, is threatened. We understand that it's threatened with erasure, with a kind of epistemological death. We grieve because we fear forgetting. We worry that people will forget what is beautiful and what is difficult and what is joyous and what is horrible about education. We worry that if we don't grieve, if we give up, we worry that we might give up the struggle to persevere and and to live. But we should not grieve alone. We shouldn't be made to feel alone. We shouldn't be made to feel crazed by our grief, feel crazed for grieving. We can and we should grieve together, grieve in public, grieve in protest. That is comfort, right? The word comfort with strength. Technologies are often wielded in ways that are meant to imply that humans are weak and messy and slow and stupid and replaceable. humans are strong and messy and awkward and flawed, but irreplaceable, all of us, right? And our strength comes from this vulnerability, from our humanity together in the flesh, not isolated, not individualized through some algorithm. And I don't think we can allow systems and practices and machineries to foreclose this humanity, to automate decisions, to automate expressions, to tell us what we should learn and what we should think and what we should write and what we should say. We have to struggle with education, in this imperfect and sometimes awful, but liminal, and that means temporary space of learning, right? There is no good way to say this, really, but to say that AI is in some ways, actually, not even in some ways, in all ways, the antithesis of education. It's the antithesis of the future. It's a kind of epistemological death. And I recognize, thanks to capitalism and neoliberalism and racism and imperialism, that we have long been surrounded by these efforts to crush us, and we are grieving already. And yet we go on. So, one final note before I wrap up and take some questions that I think I would be remiss not to state very clearly, even though I think this is a good way, but it's not a very polite way to say it. And that is some men, and I do mostly mean men, would rather spend trillions of dollars on an idea that is financially, technologically, morally, and environmentally unsustainable. They would rather destroy democracy, destroy education, destroy the planet than just get therapy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Gosh, I have so many thoughts. We'll go ahead and open the chat if you want to drop questions there. I think there's also a Q&A space. There might be, I'll have to look down below as well, but you can add a question and then I will help navigate those questions. You know, I was thinking about your point about grieving together. Right, as an expression of love for education, a love for right, being part of each other's lives that way. Um, uh, I'm wondering, I'm just trying to start to imagine how to do that, because I think you're right. I think there is a push in many ways to be more individualistic, right? And be more like people take their stances on AI or they take their, right? And then that becomes their thing, right? It's just so divisive in so many ways about everything. Um, how are you seeing how people are coalescing around a grief together out loud? Have you seen that? Or yeah, I just wondering more of your thoughts on that. And then people can be putting in their questions as I get to start with mine.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that I think in some ways what happens with grief is that it is so um and rightfully so, it is so sort of debilitating that it can be very hard to know what to do, to have the energy to know what to do. And I think that that is in some ways, like literally and metaphorically, the place that many educators find themselves in. It has been an incredibly hard. You could run the slider of the timeline back a long, 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 long way, short or long. And so I think that it can feel very disempowering, very overwhelming to respond. I think that one of the things to remember, and again, I think I think there are ways in which we are artificially separated from one another and then physically, I think, kept apart as well. But I think, coming together in in the flesh whenever possible, um, in space that is shared space with one another is just incredibly important. I mean, I think that evolutionarily speaking, humans, I think we need that. So I think that being in space, being together with one another provides opportunity, as we know in the classroom. I mean, not just for sort of everybody gets along, but for some real important and difficult conversations to have. But I think it happens better um, when we're together than when we're apart. And then I think it gets further exacerbated by technologies that I think that make the ability to have dialogue and discussion just a lot more difficult. I think there are all sorts of like clues and cues that we get from reading humans, from reading humans' bodies, from reading humans' faces, from our gestures that make understanding, that facilitate understanding, and that facilitate relationality that that our internet technologies um, make it tougher to do.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm just nodding along. Yes, we get to hear from each other, but it's very different than being in the same room as each other for sure. Um, so we have a couple of questions that have come in. One, we were just talking as a class before we invited everyone else in about your book, Teaching Machines. And I too was thinking this question that Kathy Webster posted. She says, having studied the history of ed tech, right? So thinking about that longer history and pre-personalized learning, right? Where do you see education going from here?
I think one of my concerns, and this is even separate from the sort of the AI hype, one of my concerns is always that we are building separate tiers of education, right? I mean, and this isn't new. We've done this forever. We can think of this as like a private school, public school divide, right? But in which one group of people, let's just say wealthy people, access to capital, with access to privilege, are going to have a very different educational experience than will poor people, marginalized people, people of color. Um, and so I think that technology, I think, exacerbates that. I think that I can see a future, particularly if we aren't fully committed to equitable education, to access to education. I can see a future in which um, education for some people is sort of small class discussion led, sort of Socratic, with small groups, with a human, and everyone else gets AI chatbot worksheet, computer-driven quiz machines. That seems to me sort of what, again, even without the AI stuff, the direction that we're going. You can think about the ways in which sort of affluent students have a very different experience with technology, with all sorts of technology, not just sort of laptops, but what their schools look like technologically is quite different than what students look like from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. I think whose schools, whose schools are use a lot of surveillance, right? Whose schools use technology to control, to discipline, to punish, and for whom is technology sort of this promise of something that's exploratory and following your own curiosity and being able to sort of be in charge of your own education.
That kind of connects to Sinai Noor's question here around, does surveillance tech capitalism echo in today's ed tech? And so I'm hearing that as one particular way, right? Like the further divide of the haves and have nots, not just technologically but culturally, right? Access, and so just thinking about how advancements of technology are advancements of surveillance. Yeah, so your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's really, I mean, one of the things that's really striking to me is for a very long time, I think uh, Western or Americans have said um, the kind of surveillance technology, governmental surveillance technology is something that China does, but we don't do that in the US. But in fact, I think what we've seen is that we've built a vast surveillance network in this country. It's just been used for advertising, right? It's just primarily we've built this huge surveillance apparatus that's used for advertising. And in some ways, what education, the sort of personalized education promise is really an advertising promise. It's sort of like, how do we pitch this product to a student dialed in so that it actually meets the profile that we've designated for them so that they click on the button and buy something. And I think that what we're seeing with this current administration, and certainly with the with immigration, is that we're seeing that divide between government surveillance and corporate surveillance dovetails pretty well. That works together really powerfully. And I think that has some pretty frightening implications for education, as education has, I think, for the past 100 years, as I talk about in my book, really bought into this idea that if we can just gather enough data about students, right? If we can just know everything there is to know about students, that we're going to be able to personalize education for them, that we're going to be able to engineer a system that really is perfectly designed to meet their intellectual and academic needs. But I think that what we can see now is that if we gather all this data about students, that actually we are going to be we've created a situation where we're putting students at risk. That this isn't about what students can become, but this is wrapped up in all sorts of punitive measures of making sure that some students don't become.
I want to give people a chance if they have any remaining questions, but there were some comments here that I want to read out for those who can't see um, the comments here. Jacob Pleasance shared, for all the efforts to degrade education, schools are still amazing places to bring people together. That might just be the best institutions we have. Thinking about that, right? And then Jeffrey Austin responded, the class, quoting bell hooks, the classroom remains the most radical space of possibility in the academy, from bell hooks, and reclaiming the magic means reclaiming possibility from the clutches of corporate publishers and ed technologists and from endless job training and certification. I just think, thank you for your contributions. Everyone, those great thoughts to add on. And now we have a couple other questions. Do you have time for a couple more?
Sure, totally.
Okay. Fantastic, thank you. Uh, they're also saying thank you for your talk. This is from Ryan. Okay, here we go. As another person with the Resist Gen AI, don't forget surveillance capitalism perspective, have you found any effective ways or frames to help establish common grounds community with people in education who are enthusiastic about what they believe these, and he puts this in quotes, Gen AI tools can do? Maybe even quotes around tools. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is a challenging one. I think that um, I think that one of the things that is, I think, particularly challenging is uh, we live in American culture in particular, American society is, I think, deeply ideologically committed to technology, committed to gadgets. Man, Americans, we love gadgets. We will go out and buy the dumbest kitchen gadget if we think that like we could I mean, I'm sure if you open my kitchen drawers here. I'm just gesturing towards my kitchen. You know, there are some like ridiculous tools in there, but we believe so wholeheartedly in gadgeteering everything, right? We will gadgets use a gadget rather than like actually step back and think about what are some other ways that we might solve a problem. So I think it's an uphill battle in our society to argue that that technology isn't the answer, because I think that we're fully committed to technology being the answer. Instead, you hear things, and I think I saw someone sort of gesture towards this, is that, well, what if we just use it for good, right? And so I think we'll wrestle with some of the most really destructive, menacing tools of surveillance and control, and try really hard to say, but what if we can wield this for good, instead of saying, do we actually need this tool at all? Does this tool meet our values? Does this tool or is this actually antithetical and deeply antithetical to our mission, to our values, to the things that matter? I think that we're really committed to technology, which sort of makes it hard to say no, as no is seen as unreasonable, irrational, not realistic. I mean, I think that you hear so many people who insist that the future is going to be AI, that AI is inevitable. There's nothing you can do. There's no stopping it. So you might as well just surrender. And I don't think that's true. There's no reason that we don't have to surrender our future. We don't have to acquiesce to to the demands of the richest companies and the richest people on the world. We have agency, we have autonomy. We should push back. One of the things I think that technology, broadly speaking, has done has actually reduced our agency in the classroom in particular, right? I think that teachers know, for example, the ability to sort of rearrange the furniture in a classroom, to be able to say, ugh, rows, we're not sitting in rows. We're gonna like put the desks in a circle. We can rearrange the space. We can do different things with the space. We have agency and control to be able to do that. But with technology, you lose control over the infrastructure. You lose the ability to sort of have that control over what things happen, the way in which things happen. These tools bring with them an idea of what teaching looks like, what learning looks like. It seems to look a lot like discussion boards and multiple choice quiz questions and little boxes in Zoom. And there's sort of an imagined pedagogy for the developers. Well, sometimes they don't even think about pedagogy at all, let's be honest. But I think there's a pedagogy that's imagined, and it can be very difficult to have other pedagogies, right? And I think that that's the sort of push for AI actually forecloses a lot of opportunities to do the kinds of teaching, to have the kinds of practices that, as I said in my talk, a deeply traumatized country desperately needs right now. We don't actually maybe need to auto generate stuff as much as we need to be able to come together and recognize one another's trauma and spend time in collective spaces learning how to learn together, to be together, to listen together, to respect and trust one another seems like a much more useful way to spend our time than to adopt a technology that's founded on deception, distrust, and isolation.
Oh, thank you so much. I think that also kind of addresses Aisha's question here about how do we manage things in a healthy way, right? Like if this is a disease, I hear that healthy approach, right? Lean into the relational, into the connection, into the community, and as spaces, schools to do that. So thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank
And
you for having me.
yes, yes, I always will be happy to have and hear from you. Um, and if anyone has any remaining thoughts, feel free to add them as the chat as we're leaving. And hopefully we can see you at our next talk. It's next week, next Wednesday. Dr. Cynthia, oh no, I just lost her last name out of my mind. Dr. Sheen, what's her last name? Bennett, right? So hopefully you all can enjoy it. Join us for that. It's on AI accessibility, disability, and kind of ways forward there too. So another fantastic talk next week. So thank you so much, Audrey Waters, and we'll see you all online.